My fiancée came home from her bachelorette party and something was wrong. I stayed silent for 48 hours. What I did next ended everything. In the best way possible. In the best way possible is doing a lot of work in that sentence, and I want to be honest about that from the start. There is no version of this story in which everything ended well for everyone involved. What ended well was my life, which is not nothing, and which I believe I owe it to myself to say clearly rather than wrapping in the kind of careful qualification that makes storytellers seem more sympathetic but less truthful. What happened was devastating in the immediate term. What it produced, over the months that followed, was something I would not trade. But let me start at the beginning, because the beginning is what makes the ending make sense. My name is James. I am 33. I work in structural engineering, bridges, primarily, the specific mathematics of structures that have to hold enormous weight across long spans without failure. I have spent 10 years thinking professionally about what makes things hold and what makes them break. I did not apply this thinking to my relationship with enough rigor. That is the honest assessment. Sophie and I had been together for 4 years when the bachelorette party happened. We got together when I was 29 and she was 27, introduced by her cousin at a dinner that was supposed to be something else entirely. A farewell party for someone leaving the country, which I had attended as a courtesy and which became, in retrospect, one of the more consequential evenings of my life. Sophie was a graphic designer, creative, visually precise, someone who noticed the aesthetic quality of things the way I noticed their structural properties. We were complementary in a specific way that made the relationship work. She saw things I didn't, I saw things she didn't, and the overlap was warm and productive. We traveled well together. We argued occasionally and resolved things quickly. We made each other better in the specific and unmistakable ways that tell you a relationship is the right one rather than simply a comfortable one. We got engaged at the 3-year mark. The proposal was mine, planned carefully, executed on a weekend trip to the coast, on a cliff walk with the sea below us in the late afternoon light. She said yes before I had finished. We drove home that evening engaged, calling family from the car, the particular happiness of something decided and decided well settling over both of us like good weather. The wedding planning began in earnest 4 months later. Sophie was thorough in the way designers are. She had opinions about everything, from the invitation typography to the table settings, and most of her opinions were good. The wedding was booked for 7 months from the point at which this story reaches its center. Everything was in order. Everything was, by every external measure, precisely as it should be. The bachelorette party was organized by Sophie's best friend, Clara, a woman I had always found slightly difficult to read, warm on the surface and careful underneath, the kind of person who tells you exactly what they think you should hear. It was a 3-day trip, 2 nights away in a city 3 hours from home, a rented house, a group of Sophie's closest friends. Sophie came home on the Sunday evening. I want to describe what I noticed, because this is the part that matters, the gap between what I was told and what I actually observed. She came through the door at 7:30. I had been home all day, working on a project that I'd brought back from the office. I heard the key in the lock and came to the hallway, and the first thing I noticed was her face. Sophie is someone who expresses easily. Her face is one of the more readable faces I've known. She is not a person who conceals things naturally, which is part of what I loved about her. Tiredness looks like tiredness. Stress looks like stress. What I saw in the hallway at 7:30 on that Sunday was not the face of someone who had had a celebratory weekend with her closest friends. It was the face of someone carrying something. Specifically, the compressed, careful quality of someone managing information they have not decided what to do with. She hugged me. The hug was right, the right duration, the right warmth. But it had a quality of deliberateness, like it had been assembled rather than arrived at. I noticed this. I filed it. She was quieter than usual for the rest of the evening. Not dramatically so. She talked, she asked about my weekend, she made a cup of tea. But the conversation had a texture of surface to it, a lightness that was maintained with slight effort. She went to bed early, citing tiredness from the journey. I lay awake for a long time after she fell asleep, not in anguish but in the particular alert stillness of someone whose instincts are telling them something their mind is not yet ready to formalize. The next morning, Monday, she was almost back to normal. Slightly careful still, but less visibly so. She went to work. I went to work. We texted during the day in the ordinary way. She came home. We had dinner. She was warm and present, and by the end of the evening I was telling myself that I had misread Sunday. That I was projecting. That 3 days of celebration was genuinely tiring, and the face I had seen in the hallway was the face of someone exhausted rather than someone managing something. I almost believed myself. I am good at almost believing myself when the alternative is something I don't want to think about. Tuesday morning. Sophie had already left for work. I was having coffee before getting ready, phone on the counter, not doing anything deliberately. Sophie was slightly more relaxed by Tuesday evening. I think she had begun, over the course of Monday, to conclude that whatever Sunday's expression had conveyed had gone unnoticed, that she had gotten through the dangerous period without the conversation arriving. There was a visible easing in her, subtle, but measurable to someone who was paying close attention. I called Clara on Wednesday afternoon, from my car in the car park at work. She answered on the third ring. I said, "Clara, this is James. I saw your message to Sophie on Tuesday morning. It appeared on the tablet." A long silence. Then, "Oh God." I said, "I need you to tell me what happened." She said, "James, I can't." I said, "Clara, I am getting married in 7 months. I have a right to make that decision with full information. Tell me what happened." Another silence. Longer. Then she told me. I will not reproduce what she told me in full, because the specific details belong to Sophie and to a situation that is private even in the context of a story being told. What I will tell you is this. Something had happened at the Bachelorette party. It involved a man who was not me. It was not insignificant. Clara had known about it from the moment it occurred and had spent 2 days urging Sophie to tell me, which was why the message I had seen had arrived when it did. I thanked Clara. I ended the call. I sat in my car for 20 minutes. Then I drove home. We are right at the conversation. The one James has been preparing for 48 hours. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. You need to hear every word of this. Sophie was in the kitchen when I came home. Making dinner, something that required focus, her back to the door, a podcast playing quietly in the background. I came in, set my bag down, and said, "Can you turn that off, please?" Not a question. She heard the register and turned around. She turned off the podcast. I said, "I spoke to Clara this afternoon." The effect of those 6 words on her face was immediate and complete. Every piece of the careful normality of the past 2 days simply dissolved. She said, "James." I said, "Sit down." She Saturday. I sat across from her. I said, "Tell me what happened." Not Clara's version. Yours. What followed was 40 minutes. I will not timestamp it in the way I have timed other things in this story, because those 40 minutes had a quality of their own that resists that kind of precision. She talked. She cried. She explained and apologized and explained again. The details arrived in pieces, some more difficult than others, and I received all of them with the specific stillness of someone who has already done their processing and is now in the phase of collecting information rather than reacting to it. When she finished, I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, "Why didn't you tell me on Sunday?" She said, "I thought I could. I thought I thought maybe it would be okay if you never knew." I said, "But Clara knew." She said, "Clara was there." I said, "So Clara was always going to be carrying this on your behalf. That was the arrangement you had made." She said, I know how that sounds." I said, "It sounds like you made a decision to protect yourself at Clara's expense as well as mine." She had no answer for this. I said, "I'm going to ask you one question and I need you to answer it completely honestly. Not the version of honest that protects you. Completely." She said, "Okay." I said, "If I hadn't seen that message, if Clara's text had not arrived on the tablet, were you ever going to tell me?" The silence that followed was the most important answer she gave me all evening. It lasted 7 seconds. I counted them. Then she said, "I don't know." I said, "I think you do know. And I think the answer is no." I slept in the spare room. In the morning, I called my parents and told them the wedding was off. My mother said, "James." Just that. The way mothers say your name when they are absorbing something difficult. My father said, "Are you all right?" I said, "I will be." He said, "Do you need anything?" I said, "Not right now. I'll call you this weekend." They accepted this. They are not people who press. I called the venue. I called the caterers. I called the registrar. Each call was brief and factual and, in its particular way, one of the stranger experiences of my adult life, the systematic dismantling of an event that 6 days earlier had been 7 months away and entirely real. Sophie remained in the flat for the first week. We moved around each other with the careful courtesy of two people who have said everything significant and have now arrived at the practical. She was, in that week, genuinely and visibly devastated, and I want to record this because I think it matters that she was not unaffected. She was not a villain. She was a person who had done something that fell outside the boundaries of who she had presented herself to be, and who was now living in the aftermath of that gap. We had one more real conversation, 10 days after the kitchen table. She said, "Is there anything?" I said, "No." She said, "I still love you." I said, "I know. But love isn't the issue. The issue is trust. And what happened and what you chose afterward have removed the foundation for that." She said, "What if I could rebuild it?" I said, "I don't think that's what I want to spend the next year of my life doing." She said, "You've decided completely." I said, "Yes." And that was the last real conversation we had. The year that followed the Bachelorette party was one of the hardest and most productive years of my life, in proportions that shifted gradually as the months passed. Hard at first, productive increasingly, and by the end of it something that I would not, genuinely would not, undo. I threw myself into work with a focus I hadn't had in years, the specific concentration of someone who has cleared a major distraction from their life and is now applying the freed energy to something that merits it. A project I had been peripherally involved in became, over the following months, one I led. It was among the most demanding things I'd done professionally. It was also among the most satisfying. I traveled alone for the first time in 4 years. A month after the wedding date that didn't happen, I was in Japan, a place I had always wanted to visit and that Sophie had never been particularly interested in. I spent 2 weeks there, walking cities, visiting temples, sitting in tea houses and eating things I couldn't name and looking at bridges with the particular appreciation of someone who understands the mathematics of what they are looking at. I came back with a clarity about my own tastes and preferences, uncomplicated by negotiation with anyone else's, that reminded me of what it felt like to be fully, uncompromisingly yourself. I met someone, eventually, slowly, cautiously, in the way that people meet people when they have been through something significant and have decided that the next relationship will be entered with full information and full eyes. Her name is Anna. She is an architect. On our first date, she said, "Tell me something true about yourself." I thought about it and said, "I once stayed silent for 48 hours when I should probably have spoken immediately, and the silence produced a better outcome than speaking would have." She said, "That's a very specific thing to know about yourself." I said, "Yes. It took some doing. In the best way possible." That is what I said at the beginning, and I want to come back to it now that you have the whole picture. Ending a 4-year engagement 7 months before a wedding that had been planned in careful, loving detail is not the best way possible by any ordinary measure. What made it the best way possible was not the ending itself but what the ending freed. A year of genuine, unencumbered, self-directed living. Work done with full attention. Travel taken on my own terms. The gradual, honest understanding of who I was without someone else's needs shaping the answer. And now, something that is beginning from a place of complete information. Complete clarity. Complete choice. Sophie gave me none of those things by what she did at the Bachelorette party. She gave them to me by what I chose to do with the 48 hours after I came home. Leave a comment. What would you have done in that hallway on Sunday evening? Would you have spoken immediately or waited? And subscribe, because next week's story is the one I've been most looking forward to sharing, and I think it's going to surprise you somewhere you weren't expecting.